"I ain't young, and I ain't small," she told him, standing proud in the dust. The cowboy smiled, slow and sure. "That makes two of us." Neither of them knew it yet, but that was the moment too weary. Heart stopped surviving and started living. The world knew Silas by the silence that followed him. It was in the set of his shoulders, the slow, deliberate way he moved, and the quiet economy of his cabin. A bed built for one man's sleep, a single cup hanging from a nail by the stove, a lamp that he lit at dusk and extinguished at dawn, its low glow a solitary star in the vast, dark prairie. His hands, broad and calloused from decades of work, knew the language of mending fences, soothing nervous livestock, and hefting an axe, but they had long forgotten the shape of another's. He lived a life pared down to necessity, and he had convinced himself it was enough. The quiet was not loneliness. It was peace. The solitude was not emptiness. It was order. But some nights, the flame of his lamp seemed to cast a shadow shaped like a question, and the silence in the room felt less like peace and more like a held breath, waiting. She arrived with the midday heat, a disturbance in the steady rhythm of his world. He saw her first from the edge of his property, a figure walking with a determined, exhausted gait, kicking up dust with every step. Her wagon stood a mile back, one wheel shattered against a rock. Silas watched from the shade of his porch, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle that leaned against the wall, a habit as natural as breathing. She did not look like a threat, but the frontier taught a man that threats rarely announce themselves. She stopped at his gate, her hands gripping the rough wood. She was not a girl. Her face held the fine lines of worry and weather, and her body was solid, strong, not willowy. There was a pride in the way she held her head, even as weariness slumped her shoulders. "Sir," she said, her voice raspy with dust, "my wagon's broke. I need water. And if you've work, I'll trade it for a meal and a place to rest until I can figure my next move." He gave a slow, single nod, unhooking the canteen from his belt and holding it out. He didn't move from the porch. She had to come to him. She did, her eyes never leaving his, a flicker of assessment in their depths. She drank, a long, deep swallow, and handed it back. "Thank you." He gestured with his chin toward the cabin. "There's stew. You can sleep in the barn. It's clean. I'm Elara," she said, as if offering a piece of collateral. He considered her for a long moment. "Silas." Her gaze was direct, her chin high. "I appreciate the charity, Silas, but I mean to earn my keep. I ain't young, and I ain't small. I can work." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. A rare thing. "That makes two of us." The first days were a negotiation of space, a silent mapping of new boundaries. Elara moved with a quiet efficiency that respected the established order of his home. She'd take the water bucket to the well before he thought to do it, her presence a soft sound of rope and wood in splashing water in the morning hush. She found his mending basket, the contents stiff with disuse, and her needle began to move through his worn shirts, the tiny, even stitches a stark contrast to his own clumsy repairs. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He watched the way her hands, capable and sure, kneaded dough for biscuits on a floured board. He heard the low hum that sometimes escaped her lips when she was focused on a task, a sound that filled a silence he hadn't realized was so profound. He'd leave a basket of vegetables from his garden on the back step, and hours later the cabin would be filled with the rich smell of soup. No words were exchanged about the division of labor. It simply settled between them, a shared rhythm. One evening he returned from the fields to find her scrubbing the wooden floor on her hands and knees. He stopped in the doorway, the size of him filling the frame. She looked up, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, the reflexive fear of a woman used to a man's displeasure. He simply unlaced his dusty boots on the porch, leaving them outside before entering in his socks. He said nothing, But the gesture was a language she understood. It said, "I see your work. I will not undo it." That night, he ate the stew she'd made, and for the first time, the meal felt less like sustenance and more like a communion. Elara learned Silas through his actions. He was a man of few words, but his hands spoke volumes. He showed her the hidden spring where the water ran coolest. He adjusted the pitch of the axe handle to better fit her grip, shaving the wood down with a patient knife until it rested comfortably in her palm. He never stood too close, never let his touch linger, yet his awareness of her was a palpable thing. He seemed to know when she was tired before she did, placing a stool near the stove without comment. One afternoon, he brought out a small rifle, its stock smooth with age. "You should know how," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't touch her to correct her stance. Instead, he stood apart, using his own body to demonstrate. "Keep your elbow high, sight down the barrel. Squeeze, don't pull." His instruction was practical, respectful of her intelligence. She fired at a tin can perched on a fence post, the recoil jarring her shoulder. She missed. She set her jaw, reloaded, and fired again, clipping the edge. A small, satisfied breath escaped her. When they were done, she cleaned the weapon as he had shown her. She walked over to him and held it out, offering it back to him with the stock forward, the barrel pointed safely at the ground. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a barest fraction of a second. It was the first time they had touched. His eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw not just a protector, but a man who was offering her a piece of his own strength, trusting she would know how to hold it. That evening, as she was sweeping the porch, a goat from his small herd nudged her insistently for a piece of apple. She laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. Silas, mending a harness nearby, stilled his hands. The sound was unfamiliar in his quiet world, but it felt like it belonged there. He looked over and saw her smiling, really smiling, and the sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a yearning he hadn't let himself feel in years, a sudden, sharp ache for more than just a shared roof. It was the hope for a shared life. The autumn nights grew a sudden, sharp tooth. A wind from the north scoured the prairie, rattling the window panes and moaning in the eaves of the small cabin. Silas built up the fire until the cast-iron stove radiated a deep, bone-seeping warmth that pushed back against the encroaching cold. Elara sat on her stool, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her shoulders hunched. Silas watched the goosebumps on her arms. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled the thick wool blanket from his own bed. He didn't speak. He walked over to her and held it out. It was an offering, not a command. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and questioning in the firelight. For a moment, she didn't move. The space between them was charged with unspoken things, her caution, his care, the intimacy of the small, warm room. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He draped the heavy blanket over her shoulders, his knuckles brushing the back of her neck. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. He stepped back immediately, retreating to his own chair on the other side of the hearth, giving her space. He picked up a piece of leather to mend, focusing his attention on the familiar work of needle and thread. Elara pulled the blanket tighter, the scent of him wood smoke, clean earth, and faint masculine soap enveloping her. It felt like a shield. She looked at him across the flickering space, at the strong line of his jaw cast in shadow, at his large hands working with such quiet focus. He had offered her his warmth. He had not presumed to share it. She shifted on her stool, a small rustling sound. "Silas," she said, her voice soft. He looked up. "You should sit closer." To the fire. It was an invitation, a chosen moment. He hesitated for only a second before rising and moving his chair, not beside hers, but near enough that they shared the same circle of heat, the same pool of quiet comfort against the storm outside. Word of a woman staying at Silas's homestead traveled the way all news did in a small town, on whispers carried between the general store and the saloon. It wasn't long before that news brought a visitor. Elara saw him coming from the window, a man on a fine horse, his coat too clean for the dusty track. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She knew him, Mr. Thorne, a man who had looked at her late husband's farm with avarice and at her with an appraising, possessive stare. Silas was out, checking the fence line. She was alone. Thorne dismounted and strode to the porch as if he owned it. He didn't knock. He simply stopped at the open door, his bulk blocking the light. "Well now, Elara, I heard you'd run into some trouble. Didn't picture you ending up in a place like this." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is hardly suitable for a woman of your quality." "I'm fine, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched in the folds of her apron. "Just passing through." "Passing through?" He chuckled, a condescending sound. "A woman alone has no business passing through. I have a position for a housekeeper at my ranch. Proper work. A safe place. You wouldn't have to depend on the charity of a man like him." The implication was clear, ugly. He was offering a cage disguised as a sanctuary. "I'm not in need of charity," she said, her chin lifting. "Silas has been a good neighbor." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Neighbor? Come now. We both know what a man like that wants from a woman like you. I'm offering you respectability." Just then, Silas appeared at the edge of the yard, walking with that unhurried, silent gait. He held a length of broken fence wire in one hand. He didn't quicken his pace, but his eyes were fixed on Thorne, a flat, hard stare that held more menace than any shout. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his presence a solid, unmovable fact. Thorne's confident smirk faltered. He looked from Silas's stony face to Elara's defiant one. "I'll be back," he said to her, his voice losing its slick charm and taking on a threatening edge. "You'll see I'm right." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a tense, ugly silence in his wake. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with the things Thorne had left unsaid. Elara was quiet, her movements jerky and small. Silas watched her, his own silence a heavy weight. He knew what men like Thorne were, and he knew the assumptions they made. He saw the shame and anger warring in her expression. After their meal, as she stared into the fire, he lit the lamp and brought it to the table, the circle of light pushing back the shadows. He sat opposite her, his hands resting on the rough-hewn wood. "He has no claim on you?" Silas said. The words were plain, a statement of fact. Her gaze snapped up to his. A tremor ran through her. "Men like him think they have a claim on everything," she whispered, the words ragged. "My husband. He borrowed money from Thorne. When he died, Thorne acted as if the debt included me." She took a shuddering breath, the confession spilling out in the safe, quiet lamplight. He never touched me, but his eyes did. He made me feel like property. That's why I left. I sold what I could, packed the wagon, and ran." Silas listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. When she fell silent, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered truth. "This is my land," he said, his voice low and certain. "He has no rights here. You are not property. You are a guest in my home." His gaze was direct, unwavering. He was not just reassuring her. He was giving her his vow. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the fierce, protective loyalty in his eyes. He was not a man of pretty words, but his plain speech was as solid as the rock foundation of the house. For the first time since she'd fled, she felt the iron band of fear around her chest begin to loosen. She was not just sheltered. She was defended. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The space between them, once defined by careful distance, was now filled with a quiet, acknowledged trust. One afternoon, Silas sat on the porch, working on a small piece of wood with his knife. Elara watched him, the rhythmic scrape of the blade a soothing sound. His hands, which could wield an axe with formidable strength, moved with surprising delicacy, peeling away thin curls of pine. He worked for an hour, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a butter press, the handle carved into the smooth, simple shape of a bird. The wood was warm from his grip. On the bottom, he had carved a single tentative E. It was not a courting gift. It was something more profound. It was a tool for their shared life, a recognition of her place in this home, made with his time and skill. Her throat felt tight. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick. He just nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, a flicker of something like shyness in the gesture. Later that week, as a cold front threatened, he spoke to her directly about the future. "The weather's turning," he said, stacking firewood on the porch. "Winter will be here soon. The pass will be blocked." He stopped and looked at her, his expression serious. "You are free to go, Elara. I can fix your wagon wheel. You can be on your way before the first storm, if that is your choice." He was offering her an exit, reinforcing her autonomy. He would not keep her here, a prisoner of circumstance or gratitude. The choice had to be hers. She looked around the small homestead, at the sturdy cabin, the neat stacks of wood, the garden beds put to rest for the winter. It was not a grand place, but it was safe. It was honest. She met his steady gaze. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said softly. "And I don't want to be anywhere else." The words hung in the crisp air between them. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a declaration of belonging, a choice freely made. A small, slow smile touched Silas's lips. He picked up another log. "All right, then," he said, and the simple words felt like the settling of a foundation. Thorn returned a week later, just as the sky was beginning to spit a cold, hard rain. This time, he was not alone. He brought the town sheriff, a man whose loyalty was more to Thorn's money than to any law. They rode into the yard, their horses churning the damp earth into mud. "Silas?" Thorn's voice was a belligerent shout. "We've come for the woman." Silas stepped onto the porch, Elara right behind him. He didn't reach for his rifle. He simply stood there, a bulwark. "She's not a stray to be collected, Thorn," Silas said, his voice level. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Silas, Mr. Thorn has expressed concern. It ain't proper, a woman living out here with you. It's for her own protection." Elara stepped forward, moving from behind Silas to stand beside him. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, ringing with a force they did not expect. "My protection is not your concern, Sheriff. And Mr. Thorn, I have already told you my answer." Thorn's face flushed with anger. He dismounted, taking a step toward the porch. "You'll come with me now. I have a claim. Your husband's debt." "My husband's debt died with him," she cut in, her eyes flashing. "And I will not be intimidated. I am where I choose to be." Thorn's sneer was ugly. "You choose this? A broken-down shack with a man who barely speaks?" He looked at Silas with contempt. "What can he possibly offer you?" It was the moment of public choice. Elara didn't hesitate. She looked at Silas, at his quiet strength, his steady presence. Then she turned back to Thorn. "He offers me respect," she said simply. "He offers me peace." She took another small step, closing the final gap between herself and Silas, and her hand found his. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers instantly, a firm, possessive grip. It was the most declarative touch they had ever shared. Silas looked down at their joined hands, then back at Thorn. His voice was low, final, and carried the weight of an unbreakable oath. "The lady has spoken," he said. "This is her home. Now get off my land." After Thorne and the sheriff rode away, leaving only the churned mud and the sound of the falling rain, the adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving a hollow, trembling quiet in its place. Elara's hand was still in Silas's, and she realized she was shaking. He gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before releasing them, his touch lingering for a moment as if to steady her. He turned and slid the heavy wooden bar across the cabin door, the sound a definitive thud that shut out the world. The room was dim, the rain streaking down the small window panes. He didn't speak. He moved to the stove, his actions methodical, calming. He added a log, the flames flaring up to cast a warm, dancing light across the room. He filled the kettle with water and set it on to boil. Elara sank onto the stool by the hearth, wrapping her arms around herself. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She watched him, his broad back a comforting silhouette against the fire. He was her anchor in the storm, both outside and within. He brought her a mug of hot, sweet tea. He crouched in front of her, holding it out. His eyes, serious and dark, searched hers. He was checking for cracks, for damage. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, taking the mug. The heat seeped into her cold hands. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. It was for more than the tea. It was for everything, for standing with her, for letting her stand for herself. He remained there for a moment, his presence a quiet comfort. He reached out, his touch hesitant, and gently brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her forehead. It was an act of such simple, profound tenderness it made her breath catch. He said nothing more. He simply returned to his chair, picked up his mending, and sat with her in a shared, healing silence as the rain drummed on the roof, washing the world clean. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold. A new quiet had settled over the cabin, different from the silence of solitude or the silence of caution. This was a silence of accord, of a question asked and answered. The air felt lighter. When Elara came out of the small room she had claimed as her own, she found Silas at the stove, turning bacon in a skillet. 2 plates were set on the table. 2 mugs stood waiting for coffee. It was a simple thing, but it was a declaration. We. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, unspoken grace. He passed her the salt without her asking. She refilled his coffee cup before it was empty. Their old routines were still there, but they were now imbued with a new layer of intimacy. This was no longer his home where she was a guest. It was their home. Later, as she was hanging laundry on the line, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks, he came and stood beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the wind whip the white sheets against the brilliant blue sky. "He won't be back," Silas said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. She nodded, her hands stilling on the clothesline. "I know." He turned to her, his gaze soft. He saw the strength in her that had faced down Thorne, and the quiet resilience that had carried her here. She saw the unwavering devotion in his eyes, a love expressed not in poetry, but in the solid certainty of his presence. His protection was not a cage. It was a space for her to be free. The last wall around her heart, the one built from fear and mistrust, crumbled into dust. That evening, the cabin was filled with a comfortable warmth that had little to do with the fire in the stove. The lamp cast a gentle, golden glow on the worn wooden table. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the methodical slide and click of oiled metal, a familiar, peaceful sound. Elara sat opposite him, mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle moving in small, even stitches. The quiet between them was a soft blanket. It held no tension, no unspoken questions. It was the quiet of a future settling into place. Silas set the last piece of the rifle down and looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught the silver strands in her hair, at the focused, gentle expression on her face. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was home. "Elara," he said, his voice soft, but it filled the small room. She looked up, her hands stilling in her lap. He reached across the table, his calloused, work-worn hand covering hers. His touch was warm and sure. "This is your home now," he said, the words simple, plain, and more binding than any vow spoken in a church. "If you'll have it." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. It was a smile of peace, of arrival. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. "Yes," she said. Her voice was as quiet and as certain as his. Yes. The promise was sealed, not with a kiss, but with the steadfast weight of their joined hands in the warm circle of the lamplight.